From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Today we're coming close to wrapping up our long series of episodes related to the Montana Constitutional Convention, recognizing, of course, that the new Constitution written and adopted in 1972 is maybe the centerpiece of the progressive changes in Montana that occurred during the period of the Crucible of Change. We've looked at all kinds of things in details and sections of the Constitution. We've talked about them with research analysts, with convention delegates. We've had a special episode that talked about Convention President Leo Graybill. But today we're going to do a special episode about what I refer to as the Godfather of the Montana Constitutional Convention, and therefore the Godfather of Montana's Constitution. And that's a gentleman by the name of Dale Harris. You know, we lost Dale in 1993 at the age of 48. He was a magnificent talent whose fingerprints are all over the Constitution, from its beginning ideas and its development through all the stages until it was done. And so he left a big imprint on the state of Montana before he left, but he's not here to tell us about it. The process of the organizational process of doing the Constitutional Convention and adopting the Constitution began with the Legislative Council doing a report in 1967-68 interim, and it was produced in October of 1968. That was followed organizationally by a Constitutional Revision Commission, which operated between the 1969 legislative session and the 1971 legislative session. In the 1971 legislative session, a Constitutional Convention Commission was formed. And then, of course, in January of 1972, the convention itself was held. The one piece of continuity between all of those organizational efforts was Dale Harris. He was there at the beginning, researching with the Legislative Council. He was there as the staff director of the Revision Commission and the staff director of the Convention Commission and staff director and research advocate for the convention itself. So this is a remarkable talent we're going to talk about today, and he had a remarkable series of achievements in his life, but probably none will stand out more than the Montana Constitution. In talking about Dale, we have three special guests here today, each of whom has their own unique connection to Dale. So first is Jerry Holloron. Jerry, originally a native of Corvallis, was a former Lee newspaper state reporter and ended up going to work for the Constitutional Convention Commission. That's where he and Dale got together. He was the local government specialist on that. He was the researcher for local government. He was the chief assistant to Dale, and because of his wonderful writing talents, he was also the overall writer that edited every document that came out of that Constitutional Revision Commission. He then went on Jerry went on to serve at the convention itself as mainly the local government coordinator, researcher for local government, and the local government has his thumbprint, section has his thumbprints all over that. He had a unique working relationship with Dale. So we're going to get into that as we proceed through the programming. Secondly, we have Diana Dowling. And by the way, Jerry's appeared on several other episodes of our Crucible as well. And Diana's been on our Crucible. Diana and I first met, I think we've all met way back then. And we worked on the executive reorganization. And Diana was on that staff. She's an attorney from Graybill, Wyoming. Carroll College graduate, that was it. And once she got to Helen and Carroll College, she never left. Diana's had a very distinguished career working in state government with the Legislative Council for many, many years, as the Code Commissioner, as the first lottery director of Montana, we like to remind people. But more importantly, she, again, was involved in the Constitution as after reorganization was done, you were shifted over to the governor's staff, and the governor loaned you to the Constitutional Convention, at which you were the person kind of in charge of the Style and Drafting Committee, which were the final words were put together for that. So Diana has some unique working reflections upon the Constitution, working with Dale. And then Mike Shields. Mike's a native of Anaconda. He came to Helena to graduate from Carroll College as well, and after later on he spent 30 years in Washington, D.C. With Senator Baucus as both as a House member and as a Senate member. Came back to Montana to work with Lieutenant Governor George Turman, but then went back to Washington, D.C., where he worked many, many years for Senator Quentin Burdick on the Environment and Public Works, and then spent 20 years in Washington, D.C. with the EPA. But his first real connection with Dale was with the Local Government Commission. After the Constitution, Montana had a new commission of local government under Governor Tom Judge, and Dale became the staff director of that as well, and that's where he and Mike first came together. So now, by the way, they became lifelong friends, and so there's a lot about Dale personally that Mike knows that none of the rest of us know. We were discussing Dale's beginnings with the Constitution over in Missoula with Ellis Waldron, with the University of Montana Political Science Department, with the kind of research that went into the Legislative Council study. And we all understood that Dale had done that work, but we didn't understand how it quite began until you told us how it really began for him. Tell us a little bit about his beginnings over there in Missoula.
Well, I'll back up even a little further. Dale grew up in Great Falls. Mm-hmm. His parents owned the old Harris Hotel in downtown Great Falls. And Dale used to tell stories. He was a bellman at about the age of 6 at the Harris Hotel. But he took care of guests and everything there, and was obviously a very outstanding student. Ended up at the University of Montana. Caught the eye of Ellis Waldron, who was the longtime director of the Montana Bureau of Research and Political Research at the university, and worked like so many other undergraduates at Missoula for Ellis, compiling the atlas of
our Bible,
the Montana political elections, and a lot of your viewers are probably too young to remember the political atlas that Waldron would edit and compile on an annual basis. I think that faded out of existence probably in the late 60s, early 70s, but it was a reference book that many Montanans used over the years, just on basic information about Montana, and the basis for the beginning of looking at research or analyzing a topic. You always went to Waldron's annual almanac. And Dale started out with Ellis, again, was an honors graduate at the university. After graduation, he had received a scholarship to the University of Chicago to pursue graduate studies there. And lo and behold, in that summer between graduation and in the fall, he was drafted. And if in those days, with the Vietnam War going full tilt, Dale was drafted, ended up at Fort Lewis in Washington. But those of you who worked with him knew that Dale always had one impediment, and that was his eyesight. And he was drummed out of the Army relatively quickly. But unfortunately for Dale, the scholarship to the University of Chicago vaporized, and he had to go to work, try to find some employment, and lo and behold, Ellis came through. And as you've described, Devin, Dale was on the ground floor with the various commissions and that initiated the constitutional revision process. So with that, he just developed this extensive knowledge of constitutional law. The one thing that I remember very vividly about Dale was if he locked onto a subject, he would, start at the beginning and work through it, and in the process would acquire information about various, what was happening around the country. He developed an extensive number of contacts, with the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, with other state government officials around the country who were involved in constitutional revision. And that all came to fore in his work on the Constitution. Dale, for me, speaking just as a friend, I've known a lot of people involved in public policy in Montana, and I can't think of anyone of that generation who was more knowledgeable about any given subject about state government, but also, more importantly, he had this incredible network of associates, friends, even opponents who he called upon at any given time to bring to bear what was needed during the debate of the Constitution, the ratification election, and then eventually the implementation.
It did seem like he had the ability to just absorb and retain this massive amount of information and be able to make sense out of it and see how he could shape that knowledge to help the Montana situation, didn't it? Now, going back at UM, and I guess in a way we were blessed to be able to have him rejected for his eyesight. He was working with Ellis Waldron, who, by the way, is we mentioned this book, that we call it our Bible, and this is the Atlas of Montana Politics, and it's put together by Ellis Waldron and Paul Wilson, and this is, if you can ever find one of these, get it, okay? But the compilation, Ellis was part of that, but he was recognized as the fella who really knew how to put stuff together in terms of research. So he had a Bureau of Government Research over there at the university, and I believe that Dale worked kind of under the auspices of that title, but it was really working with Ellis.
Yeah.
And when the Legislative Council in '67 legislature said, we want you to study this Constitution, to the Legislative Council. They were going to give it to a side group, and they couldn't get the bill passed. So they said, well, there was so much pressure, as I recall, for constitutional change, so much recognition about how bad the Montana Constitution had become over the years, how archaic it had become, that the pressure was on. So even though they didn't get the commission they wanted in the '67 legislature, they said, well, let's make it a Legislative Council study. And that Legislative Council study, they farmed a lot of the research work off to Ellis and the folks at the university. Diana, when you have one of the few copies of the original versions of that constitutional study by the Legislative Council, does Dale's name pop up in that at all, or?
No, his name doesn't, but which I never knew before you asked me to be on this, but the introduction to the 100-page report, and this was a report of the Legislative Council, and there were many, many staff reports before the final report that went into that. But in that final report, in the introduction, they thanked Ellis Waldron for being their consultant throughout the study. So I just thought, Dale Harris.
Yeah.
And at the end of that report, there was a bill, they drafted a bill to create the Constitutional Revision Commission. And Dale Harris was on that.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to assume just because the PhD doesn't recognize the work of the researchers is not uncommon. But when I saw Ellis's thumbprint on that report, it meant that what we'd heard all these years that Dale had started with the Legislative Council report, and it did have, it was the logical next step was the creation of the Revision Commission. However, that report, what they did discover in that report was that there were 262 sections to the 1889 Constitution. And of those 262 sections, 53 of them, which was 20%, needed to be revised the way they analyzed it. They said, now these can't be left, there's a certain percentage can be left, let's see, it would be about 48% could be used, could be kept of the sections of the Constitution. But 53 of those sections, or 20%, needed to be revised, but 85 sections, or 32% of the Constitution, the study showed needed to actually be replaced. They were so archaic they couldn't even be fixed. So that set the stage from a legal perspective, but the pressure was out there already. Everyone in Montana seemed to know we've got a problem. We've got a problem with our government. Part of it was the problem with the executive branch that we worked on. You had a non-functional executive branch. The legislative branch became very clear to be a problem, because when we talked about the legislative branch, we were talking about all the secrecy, that they didn't do recorded votes, that everything was done in private, in secret. You couldn't tell what anybody was really doing. They held held hearings behind closed doors, things like that people didn't like. And of course, the fine strings of control of the Anaconda Company were over all of it. So people, as Ted Schwinden said, post-World War II, began to say, we need to do something different. And it found its way into this constitutional change. And then, the step was the Revision Commission. Now, also concurrent with that, did they not also in the legislature propose the calling of a convention in the 69 session when they created the Revision Commission to do the studies? I believe in that time they also created or put on the ballot Referendum 67. Referendum 67 said, let's call a convention, because the legislature can't call a convention. Under the old Constitution, the only way it can be called is by the people calling it. So it had to be put up for a vote of the people. And so I think there was a mirror. It was an interesting way to compare this. Was the demand for change was such, and the kind of sensible approach to it was that both the reorganization of the executive branch, which was advanced by the '69 session, they funded the Reorganization Commission to do the study, and meanwhile they put on the ballot changing it to 20 departments. And there was a leap of faith, if you will, that the voters would enact that, and when they finished enacting it, the research would be done. It was the same thing with the Constitution, and I'm sure Dale had a role in that, which was to say, okay, now we're going to put this on the ballot in November 1970, but when it's done, we want to be ready. So therefore the Revision Commission, which was called for, and now that for the 2 years between the '69 session and the November election in 1970, concurrently there was promotion of the convention being called and all the research, the first layer of research. So that's, I believe, the kind of genius. There was a genius of that. It was multi-layered. Seemed to me that I wouldn't see that happening today. I think it'd all be lineal today. Nobody trusts anybody or it's like, well, geez, if we do all that research, it could be wasting money if we don't pass the thing. Let's wait and see if we pass it. It was an interesting time. Jerry, you're, well, the steps were then, Diana, that they did do the Revision Commission. While they were doing all that studying, you and I were working on the Reorganization Commission, studying that side of things. When the election was held in 1970, the convention was called. And so 2 months later, we had the '71 legislature, and in the '71 legislature, the Revision Commission was to die, and the legislature replaced it with the Convention Commission to prepare for the convention itself. That's where you came in, and Dale, when as the Revision Commission died and the Convention Commission was born, the continuity between them was Dale Harris.
Right.
Most of the staff.
Yes. He was amazing in terms of his knowledge of the areas in which we were working. I remember before the convention was called, before the vote was submitted to the people, I was a reporter at that time. This was before the Constitutional Convention, and I remember Dale being at the legislature for various things having to do with the Constitutional Convention, and I imagine they were the Revision Commission, things of that sort. But I remember being buttonholed by him on almost a daily basis. You should write a story about this, and he was just completely tied up with it, and not only knowledgeable, but also a real salesman in terms of getting information out about it. I still, I think, thinking back on those years, the thing that surprises me most is that we were able, after the legislature called for the convention to be on the ballot, and we were doing preparatory work, the amount of work that we were able to get done in essentially about 8 or 9 months, it seemed impossible at the time. And when I think back on it, I have no idea how we did it. And a lot of that was because of Dale. He was so committed to the whole process that I wonder if he ever had a moment in which he wasn't thinking about it. In specific areas which each of the researchers were working, I would guess that he probably was more knowledgeable on each of those areas than the researcher was, and was constantly giving tips of what we might look into, and he was a dynamo as far as leading the staff.
Well, you know, one mark of leadership is the willingness to hire really bright people to work with you. Some people are afraid to be next to smart people because they worry they might be smarter than they are, but it sure seemed to me when I think about the people that were on that, did all that research, and then moved on to the convention.
I cannot think of one example where Dale was afraid to have people around who would challenge him in terms of the staff. He gave us a lot of leeway in terms of our work, and had a lot of stood behind us on a lot of things, but he was very good to work for from that standpoint of someone who you knew was behind you for what you were doing, and also probably more knowledgeable than you were about it. And never, that I recall, were there examples of him fearing somebody because they might know more than he did on a certain issue. In fact, there weren't that many instances of that, but he was not at all afraid of us developing knowledge, specialized knowledge in a particular field.
One of the things I've found over the years is that, you know, if you want to get more out of people that are working with you, you lead by example.
Right.
And to do the kind of work you guys all did required a huge amount of ambition to work God knows what kind of hours. He didn't quit at 5.
No.
Did he ever?
I don't think he ever quit at 5. I can't think of instances where he was goofing off, for example.
So
it just
perhaps the reason that all that work got done was the inspiration combined with the perspiration that he was always willing to put in.
I think so.
You know, it seemed to me he was like that.
Right.
And now, he was actually responsible for hiring the staff of the Reform Commission. And then he recommended the staff, he nudged it forward.
Right.
And selected. Now, when we've been doing a lot of digging because we don't have the benefit of him being here, been looking in the records archives at the Historical Society and the newspaper archives, and have found that, yeah, his thumbprint was on that staff. He picked these people. Right. He picked you. He picked picked Jim Grady. He picked Rich Bechtel. He picked Bruce Sievers and so on. All those Rick Applegate.
Right.
The talent pool that he had surrounded himself with was stunning. Stunning. Does that speak to?
Just as an observer, and I was not, you know, I was aware that the Constitutional Convention process was going on, but I wasn't at that point involved with any of it. The thing that, looking back at it, what strikes me is most like the process on governmental reorganization before it, and then with the CON, the age of these people. You know, they were all, you know, in their early to mid-20s. Dale was 28, you know, for the bulk of the CON. You know, I don't envision a time in Montana history where maybe during the territorial convention where everybody was relatively young, but when you look at the process now, it certainly isn't people in their mid-20s.
The other thing about the people, there were probably about 10 research analysts. Almost all of them were from Montana.
Yeah.
They all had Montana roots. And I think, when I think back on it, I think that's pretty amazing. These weren't people who were from out of state, and who were on the Constitutional Convention circuit, and he did not hire those people. he hired people from Montana.
Yeah, there's a sensitivity to that, and it reflects itself. You know, there undoubtedly was a pool of people from out of state that would have been willing to come to Montana, but he found the folks that were from Montana. Now, in this hiring, he was pretty pure about it, wasn't he? If you have a little anecdote you might want to share that reflects an awful lot about his values.
Oh, we didn't take a lot of breaks as staff, but Dale took none, and we would see him in his office, and that's where he worked all day. He wasn't running around the Capitol. He was at work, and he was interviewing people for staff positions. And I had an office right close to his, and a woman was in there, had come in and was being interviewed for a secretary's job, and I was hoping for quiet. I was working on some local government problem, and all of a sudden there was this almost an explosion from his office, and she came running out his door, and he running behind her going like this, shouting, "Leave my office, leave my office." We finally found out that she had bribed him. If she would get the job, she was willing to share some of the pay with him. And
She attempted to bribe him.
she had attempted to bribe him, that's right. But I had never, and that was the only time I heard Dale explode. And I think that I would not want to be on the other end of the explosion. But it says something about the kind of person he was too. I think he was shocked by such a proposal that he would.
Well, it also probably speaks to the value he put on the job that was being done.
Yeah.
That developing this Constitution was so important to
Right.
think that it would be something as venal as buying your way into it.
Exactly.
That surely offended him.
I think I've never met anybody who was so committed to a task. He would simply zero in on something and would just bury himself in it and come up with just an amazing amount of knowledge on various
Well, the
subjects.
folks, by and large, the folks that he chose to work at the Revision Commission, the Constitutional Revision Commission, continued on. And then they picked up for the detailed writing. You did local government. Rick Applegate did the Bill of Rights type of stuff. He was 21 at the time. I was
Right.
pretty stunned by reading that. But what we found in all these programs we've done is that the research people, the work you talked about, it was almost like everybody wrote a book, so that
Yeah.
when the delegates came in, they had a Montana analyzed book about their subject, whether it be local government, whether it be the Bill of Rights, whether it be the executive branch, whether it be the legislative branch, and these education, taxation. Roger Barber wrote the taxation thing. Bruce Evers did education. These were all people that were doing this under his guidance, and they produced these essentially books.
24 reports.
Tell
and
us about
10
what?
Well,
Yeah.
I just researched this later. The last commission, the Constitutional Commission, Convention Commission, produced in that 8 months 24 reports and 10 memorabilia of some kind that were books themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, they were some
Big-
of them this thick.
500,
Each one
800
like that.
page.
Amazing.
Rick's was seven or 800.
I imagine.
Bruce Evers' was like 500 pages. They were literally books. Now, what it takes to guide folks through that, the rigor of that, the inspiration. In the meantime, while all this hardcore work is being done, he's also the chief promoter, isn't he? He's the chief advocate in the face of the public. Dale Harris was a name everyone knew. Jack McDonald was head of the Revision Commission. Alex Blewett was the head of the convention commission, but if you wanted, the go-to guy was Dale Harris, wasn't it?
And when you talk about being young, he was 60, he graduated from the U in 67. He started all this when he was what?
22.
21?
22.
20?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Because yeah.
and his knowledge was encyclopedic.
Yeah.
And professionally, I knew him over the course of probably 10 years. And in that time, all the other research that he undertook, people could disagree with Dale on any given topic, but no one questioned that he cooked the books or shaded details or omitted pertinent facts that in his research. And was with the case with the Con. These were, they weren't just reports to be filed and put on a shelf somewhere. The delegates could read through this, and there was a comprehensive analysis. What's happening around the country? What are other states doing? Why reinvent the wheel if someone in Pennsylvania or Illinois or wherever has come up with a good way to address a problem? And that was Dale. I mean, that comprehensive look at a subject, and no detail was, too small to be considered, at least in the research.
He, as he guided the public end of this thing, again, there was a pent-up demand for change in Montana, probably in the nation too at that time, but nonetheless in Montana there was a pent-up demand for change, which is what the Crucible of Change period is really about. But to turn that demand into some kind of reality was the challenge. But he was so well networked. You mentioned his tie into the League of Women Voters. I don't know if anyone want to comment on any of that, his tie into Dorothy and Lucille and Daphne and Joanne Woodard and all the people that were engaged in that.
Well, my experience with him on the local government commission, he used the League of Women Voters, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. He included them in the process. I don't think very many people realize the institutional network that's around the state from the standpoint of the Cooperative Extension Service. He tapped into that. Various organizations, he used their network to get the information out, to identify people who could, be persuasive on a given topic. And he just had that intuitive knack to try to pull as many disparate people into the process. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that the process was successful, in that so many people had a stake in it by the end of the process.
And remind us of the story Gene Bowman told as League of Women Voters in the county fairs about Dale. Gene was a delegate from Billings, was also the secretary of the convention, and has appeared on a number of Crucible episodes prior to her
And
passing.
Gene, like so many other delegates who I talked to, said they couldn't have done it without, Gene said they couldn't have done it without all those reports that, like Mike said, weren't put on a shelf. They were very well written, they were very informative, easy to read, and every delegate said they couldn't have done it without those reports. And so Jean went even further, and she was, you were talking about on one of these episodes about going to county fairs, because the League of Women Voters really started this whole thing way back when in the 20s, or whatever. They were some of the leader fights for changing the Constitution. So they were going to a county fair and they had the League of Women Voters booth or whatever. And Jean said, and Dale Harris designed this wonderful banner. And that's why they were successful.
Every detail.
He did,
every
yeah,
detail.
down to the banners and brochures and
On the other hand, he wasn't a great writer. He was a great thinker and a great comprehensive organizer who had the vision for the whole thing. And he wrote, but I think he needed you, Jerry.
He, as a lot of smart people, I think this happens to. His brain worked faster than he could write, and so the result sometimes was a little bit strained. But I think he recognized that, and I edited some of the stuff that he wrote, and there was never a problem with that. He had no, as many writers do, he had no ego tied up in the way in which you put words together, and he would readily accept change, and which is a little unusual for someone as bright and as accomplished as he was. He was not hard to edit.
But you were, as a good editor, you were cleaning up the writing to reflect his thinking, not impose your own.
No, that's right. And a lot of the times, as I recall, it was simply using a period more often. Some of his sentences tend to be
long?
marathon. Yeah.
But then again, he had the talent to figure out he needed you. And,
Well,
and to
I
take
hope
your-
so. I hope
take
so.
take that into account, you know. Now, when the 71 legislature met, they had, again, the Reform Commission went goodbye, the Convention Commission started, the core of all the researchers were hired. Dale's guiding them all through these book writing and everything else. The convention has been called. 65% of the people voted to call the convention. Now to hold a convention, they had to have elections of delegates, and they couldn't have an election right away because there were some reading in the papers. There were questions that come up. Legislators wanted to run for the convention, and the Constitution seemed like it said they couldn't. They didn't like that. So they went to the Montana Supreme Court to have a declaratory judgment on what are some of these constraints, who gets to run. And because of that court case, which didn't happen until after the legislature, the primary election for the CONCON occurred in September, with a general election scheduled in November, because the law said they had to convene on the 17th of January of 1972. So they had just like you squeeze, that was the period you had to squeeze all the research and writing into. That was a period in which everyone had to be energized, file for office, run in a primary, run in a general, then organize themselves up and get ready for a convention. And, you know, again, his thumbprint was on every bit of that. Every bit of that was pretty much orchestrated to where he proudly proclaimed, as I was reading the newspaper clippings, he proudly proclaimed as they approached September that 450 people had filed to run for the 100 seats. And none of them were the usual suspects.
Right.
They were not legislators. They were citizen delegates.
I remember some of the legislators at that time were, once the court ruled that the legislators could not serve in the convention, a number of the old line legislators let it be known that the whole effort would fail. Because they would not be able to share their vast knowledge of the Constitution with the rest of us.
Yeah, their fine hand would not be in it, so it was going to fail. And in fact, I think what they did was what everyone wanted, which is they left it alone.
Right.
And Dale was also, I want to say, the architect of even though people ran on a partisan basis, the net result of the election was 58 Democrats and 6 independents, that's 64, and 36 Republicans. And he was publicly advocating prior to their organizational session. Remember, they were elected in early November, and November 29th they had an organizational meeting. And so there's Dale Harris saying, joining with others saying, we should make this as nonpartisan or bipartisan as we can. You can do anything you want as delegates, but you don't have to sit by party if you don't want. You don't have to organize by party if you don't want. And in fact, they sat alphabetically, which in all of the programs that we had, almost every delegate said, I think the fact that we sat alphabetically and you didn't know if the person next to you was a Democrat or a Republican, you just knew they were a delegate with you, was part of what unified that body and got the work done. So that they're working with great research and everything else, but they were certainly not partisan. So he was an advocate for that openness and that participation that way in the convention itself. Now, the convention organized in late November. They had 6 weeks to come in, and in that 6 weeks, you'd been assigned earlier to help the revision commission. Assigned by, or were you just assigned? You were assigned by Governor Anderson to assist with the convention itself.
Yeah.
And you were then transferred, like most of the researchers, into the convention staff itself. So you had a pretty smoothly operating machine going in.
Right.
You know, a few wrinkles when it got there.
Yeah.
But the final product clearly was done. They got the work done. Dale started out as executive director, and then there was a fuss over authority, and there were some budget issues. Because again, they were constrained by only having little less than $500,000 to do this whole convention, including, by the way, promoting it. And there was an effort to save money to promote it, which later the court said they couldn't use. They said you couldn't use it.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
So they had to go out and start from scratch to gin up the support. But in this process, Dale had a little fuss with the commission, the president of the I want to talk about two strong-willed people, and two extraordinarily talented, capable people was Dale and Leo Graybill. And Dale had godfathered this whole thing, and then Leo was the president, and he wanted to run it, and they were having a little problem, and it kind of exploded a little bit, but the net result of it was Dale ended up focusing in on managing the research to get all done at the convention. And so he was there when it was passed. And when and you were there, tell us about, you were there style and drafting. So you took all that stuff and put it into final shape, or you and the committee.
Right. To make it all read alike, the same, and then the style and drafting committee is the one that published that. I wrote that red, white, and blue newspaper that was sent to all with the explanation
Information
to all the
guide,
voters. Yeah, but I just wanted to. We kind of skipped that Dale and his staff was responsible for preparing offices, getting all the typewriters, all of that
Everything.
for the convention. They even had a set of rules written up that the convention adopted.
Rules, yeah.
So, he was
Interns,
just
they
responsible
had interns
for.
set up. They'd worked with the libraries. Every little detail. You look at there's actually reports in there that Dale authored of every little detail of running this convention was all laid out.
That's why they did it in 57 days.
You didn't spend any time doing all that kind of crazy stuff. Did he do that same thing when he was working on local
It
government?
was, he was reading from the same script. I mean, it was detail. things that most people would consider minutia, the consistent logo, the consistent cover on all of the reports. I mean, it was, he thought of everything. And, you know, I think one of the things that came with the Local Government Commission, the Constitution mandated a review of local government. So all 56 counties and 190 so municipalities reviewed their structure and forms of government. And while many of them really didn't change all that much, a lot of the commission members were con delegates who, you know, after the convention, got involved with the voter review of local government. And as I mentioned on a previous episode, Evan, I really think none of us could have predicted what was going to happen in 1980, but the demise of the large-scale mining operations in Butte, the loss of the refinery in Great Falls, the demise of the smelter in Anaconda. For Butte and Anaconda, they consolidated local governments. And I think in large measure,
their survival
was a result of the wisdom of coming together. And I always point out the two smallest geographic counties in the state consolidated. You know, Missoula tried to do it. You know, even the slogan "Bula Bula won Missoula" didn't go too far in Missoula. But you know, from the standpoint of the impact on local government in those two areas, I think if you interviewed people after 20 or 30 years of experience, you know, it was a very positive thing. And Dale's hand on that whole process was, you know, as evident there as it was in the con.
Yeah, let's do a little with the time we have left. We have some time left, but we're getting to a close. I told you this hour would go very fast. Your kind of personal reflections, if you can, if there's some summary perspective you might want to put some exclamation points about Dale.
I think one thing that maybe tells a lot about him is that you alluded to the fact that he and Leo sort of crossed swords during the convention, and Dale, in a sense, was sort of pushed aside. Here's somebody who had worked and was the leader of the effort for a new constitution and Godfather, and suddenly was sort of pushed aside. But once the Constitution was adopted, or once the convention finished its work on the Constitution, before the vote, when there were efforts being made to get it passed, he was extremely active in those efforts of getting the Constitution ratified, even though toward the end he was sort of shoved out of the limelight. It didn't bother him.
Well, it seems like that maybe that his dedication to the cause was much more than his concern about where he was in any pecking order.
Right.
He clearly stayed with it. You know, after this little pushing around, he was right back in,
That's right.
continuing to work through the convention and then afterwards.
Right.
You know, that's a good reflection, I think. Diana, you have worked with him and seen his product.
Well, my reflection always starts with a history class from Dr. Swart out at Carroll, and he was telling the class about the Montana Constitution being one of the best in the nation, and how it got there because the delegates were seated alphabetically and they got their work done in only 57 days, and it was Time magazine featured it and it was sent internationally. He never said a word about staff, and that's when I started giving talks and stuff about, hey, you know, there was 5 years of study and lots of staff reports, and that's who should get the credit.
Mm-hmm.
Dale Harris was there from the very beginning until the very end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Mike?
Well, my perspective is tinged a lot by his early demise. Dale died at 48, and I think Montana's poorer because of it. Over the course of his career, he contributed a lot, and unfortunately, he doesn't get the recognition that he probably deserves. And I commend you for including this in the series, because he really did yeoman's work. As these two have said, he was dedicated to the cause, and you know, it was a successful effort in large measure because of what he did.
Absolutely.
Well, you know, my thought about Dale, and I did know him. I didn't play a big role in the Constitution itself, because at that time that I was in the reorganization. We were all kind of young people working together, the reorganization staff and the Constitutional Review Commission staff. We all talked to each other. We were all part of that cadre of young people who were trying to make a difference for Montana. And he always stood out as somebody that said, wow, look at this guy. He's really something. And then when the convention itself happened, I happened to be with the Democratic Party, and the word was, stay away. We don't want to do this partisan stuff. So we stayed away. And the process was better for us, so I didn't get to watch too much of that. But as I watched Dale then emerge and continue on, and I always thought of Dale Harris like he was a meteor. He went across that sky so fast and so bright, but he burned out early. That he was gone at 48, but in that time, that meteor of Dale Harris was lighting the skies of Montana, making a really, really big difference. He had the huge energy and drive and to pull people with him to make things happen, and I always thought of him like he was a meteor. So, well, we're wrapping this program up. As it is, we've talked about all elements of the Constitution. We've talked about each different segment of it. We've talked about what started it, and now we're talking about the key players. And if you think about that, the Godfather of it all was Dale Harris. And I want to thank all three of you for being willing to sit down and share your experiences about the Godfather of the Constitution. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.